Hello and welcome everybody to the Virtual Science Cafe. Thanks for joining us here on YouTube or on Facebook or on livestream.com, wherever you're taking in our program tonight. I am your host. My name is Chris Smith. Normally, I am curator for the SECU Daily Planet Theater. I'm always your host for our Thursday night science cafes. Of course, right now, the Museum of Natural Sciences in downtown Raleigh, we're not open, can't go to the building right now. So, you know what? We're going to keep bringing the science to you. We've got the internet, we've got the team and the people and the expertise. So, we're going to keep what might be one of our longest running and most popular programs going with our science cafes. Thanks for being here. So glad that you could join us. I hope that you and the people around you are doing well and that everyone is staying safe and healthy in this time. We're all doing great here. Museum folks are doing really good. We're glad that we can keep bringing the science, technology, engineering, and mathematics to you using all of our great social platforms that we have. So thanks for tuning in. Tonight's program, I think you're going to enjoy it. Now, a few folks, like some of the diehard museum fans out there, you might remember this special guest. He visited the museum just a few short years ago to deliver a presentation on his book, Animal Weapons. Tonight, my special guest is Dr. Doug Emlen. Doug is a professor of biology at the University of Montana and a prolific author from what I'm seeing, and he's won numerous awards for his writing and research. Doug, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
How are you doing in Montana?
Montana's doing pretty well. We all discovered this is a pretty amazing place to go to ground and shelter in place. So I actually saw a mountain lion hiking from behind my house a week or two ago. So we're doing okay.
Wait, you saw a mountain lion back behind your house?
Well, we save a lot of time not driving anywhere. So when we get finished with Zoom meetings, I found it's pretty easy to get out and hike. And people have been doing a lot of that around here. It's a good way to socially distance. So yeah, going on a ridge behind our house, probably 30 yards away. It's only the second time I've ever seen one on foot, face to face. It was cool.
Wow,
So,
that
but
is
speaking more
amazing.
generally, I also should say, I want to shout out that Montana was pretty swift to enact the social distancing protocols. And the University of Montana was really fast, ahead of the curve, and it worked. If you look at the numbers, Montana is doing really well. So knock on wood, so far so good.
I'm glad to hear that everything's going well there for you. So you're a professor of biology at Montana, and your research focus have been the weirdest, the best animal weapons. What's going on?
So, all right. So when you let me flip and share my screen, I'll show you a couple pictures of the kind of stuff we do. But yeah,
you know what? I'll go ahead and I'll just turn it over to you. You can explore and expound on the world of animal weapons with us.
Let me do it. Let's do this. So share screen. This is new for me too, by the way. This is my first digital presentation. So we'll see how it goes.
I'm glad we could break you in.
I know, you got to start somewhere, right? So there, and no, I'm psyched to come back digitally. Does that work? Can you see it?
Looks great on my end.
All right. Well, so yeah, let me pick up with where you started. So I am an evolutionary biologist, and I study the development and the evolution of animal weapons. Now, specifically in my case, this means things like the horns of beetles. And we actually use a whole suite of different techniques and approaches to try to study these types of extreme weapons in these beetles. So for example, we use biomechanics and engineering approaches to look at how beetle horns function. So considering them as tools, mechanical things that lift or pry or twist a rival beetle off of a tree. And we use genomic and developmental genetic approaches to study how these weapons grow. So literally down to the genes and the developmental pathways that build a beetle horn and control how large that horn grows to be. And we use population genetics to reconstruct how these horns have evolved. So how they've changed in size from population to population and from species to species. And we meaning my graduate students these days, we even spend long nights out in the rain watching these beetles in the wild to see how they fight and what they're fighting over. Can you hear that? Are we good?
I think we're good now. Uh-oh.
I just said that. No.
Yeah.
So should I keep going? Okay.
Yes, please.
All right. Well, I was hearing myself say these things twice. All right. So we even spend nights in the rain watching them in the field to try to look at how they use the weapons, what they're fighting over, and to try to actually measure the strength of selection acting on these weapons in the wild. But even though that's what we normally do, I'm not going to talk about any of that today, because a few years ago, I had a chance to step back from the beetles and to pour through the literature on all kinds of different animal extremes. So crab claws, walrus tusks, fly antlers, elk antlers, the works. The weapons in these species are so outlandish in proportion that they look like they shouldn't be possible. I mean, these animals, if you look at them, they look like they should tip over or trip or collapse under the bulk and the weight of these structures that they're producing. So I started compiling everything I could on all of these crazy and wonderful weapon extremes to ask really basic questions like, how did their weapons get to be so big? And is there such a thing as too big? And I also scoured the literature on another type of weapon extreme, our own. Because as you all know, we humans make weapons too. Now, manufactured weapons aren't parts of our bodies like tusks or horns, and instructions for their construction aren't encoded in DNA. But their forms change over time in much the same way that animal weapons do. And the directions of this evolution are molded by similar forces of selection. So successful models are copied and spread, while less successful models gradually disappear. So that populations, if you will, of manufactured weapons transform through time. And when the conditions are just right, these weapons can get taken to extremes too. So surging forward to bigger and bigger sizes, deadlier, faster, and vastly more expensive. So I laid side by side then the literatures on all of these animal and military weapons to look at how and why weapons get big. And wow, am I glad that I stopped what I was doing to take the time to do this, because the parallels that I found rocked my world. I mean, they utterly transformed the way that I look at extreme weapons, changing in many ways how I looked at my own research system, the beetles, and even to a startling degree, changing the way that I look at the political realities of the world around us, things like terrorism and weapons of mass destruction and national security. So extreme weapons, I'm going to suggest to you today, are extreme weapons. Animal, human, it doesn't matter, because their stories are exactly the same. And so with the time that I've got right now, what I want to do is to show you what I mean by highlighting 3 of the parallels between animal and military or human weapons. And the first of these starts with a problem. I mean, arguably, it's a big problem, the sort of overarching question in all of the animal systems, at least, and that is, why do only some species have these really big weapons? The quick answer is simply that weapons in these particular species get caught up in an arms race. So they get swept into a cycle where bigger was better, a lot better, so that weapon sizes start to ratchet up fast, culminating in these species where animals wield these extraordinary structures. But realistically, all that does is reframe the question then. Why did arms races get triggered in these particular species and not in so many others? And this might look like a lot of species, but I assure you it's not. Considered against the backdrop of the diversity of life, this is nothing. This is a pittance. It's a drop in the bucket. This is less than 1/10 of 1% of described animal species. So what's so special about these particular species? How can we explain why they have such big weapons when so many other species, even closely related species, don't? So I guess what I'm getting at is there a generalizable set of conditions that precipitate arms races in animals? And can an appreciation of those conditions help us explain this big picture pattern of morphological diversity? Well, it was clear right away that two of the central tenets of my field of biology, animal behavior, held sway here. And together, they helped explain a lot of this diversity. So first, there was no question that the biggest animal weapons were all the product of what we call sexual selection. So intense competition among males for access to females was a driver of weapon evolution in most, if not all, of these species. And I can explain the logic of sexual selection, including why it is almost always males battling with rival males and not the other way around, after the talk. Suffice it to say that the backdrop for all of these weapons was males battling with rival males over access to females. So intense competition was, in a sense, the first critical ingredient of these animal arms races. And the second ingredient, also a fundamental tenet of my field of animal behavior, concerns the economic defensibility of critical or limiting resources. So you're all almost certainly familiar with the military equivalent of this. Some locations, by virtue of their restricted access, are more readily defended than others. And surrounding things with high walls that open to the outside only through sturdy gatehouses, so narrow restricted tunnels that serve as choke points, these can make these places much more cost-effective to defend. So they act as force multipliers. And you're probably just as familiar with the cybersecurity equivalent of this, where so-called firewalls restrict access to a small number of heavily protected gateways and tunnels. I love this artist's rendition of a VPN tunnel, by the way. Well, the same logic applies to animals too. And all else being equal, resources that are clumped or otherwise restricted access, so that have smaller attack surfaces, these are more likely to be cost-effective for animals to defend than are resources that are more uniformly distributed or dispersed across the landscape. So this is the essence of what we call resource defense mating systems in animals. And together with intense competition, these two ecological principles go a long way towards explaining that big picture pattern, why some species have these big weapons and so many others do not. I love these ideas. They're not wrong. They're in all the textbooks. I've been teaching these ideas in my classes for 20 years. But they're not enough. There's still a piece missing. There has to be a piece missing because lots and lots of species have intense competition and localized or defensible resources, but they don't have big weapons. And I used to see this all the time. When I started out as a graduate student and I worked with dung beetles, I could be working in a Panamanian rainforest looking at howler monkey dung, or in a pasture in North Carolina, which is where I did a lot of my work years ago, or in Australia, or looking at elephant dung. It didn't matter, because in all of these places, we would find side by side species with and species without big weapons. I mean, ecologically, these are incredibly similar species. They live in the same habitats. They're active in the same seasons. They're literally found in the same piles of dung. But only about half of these species are investing in these big weapons. Well, they all faced intense male battles between males over access to females. And they all guarded localized or defensible resources, either females inside tunnels or little balls of dung. But it turns out that only the species that fought inside tunnels ever had the horns. Now, I used to explain this by pointing out, well, tunnels restrict access to key resources, making them cost-effective to defend. This is exactly as theory predicted. But honestly, little tiny balls of dung with females clinging to them are pretty localized and defensible too. So what else is different? Well, that question haunted me for years, since the pattern was so striking, and yet their overall ecologies and life histories were so similar. Eventually, I started looking elsewhere. I started looking at the details of animal contests and the fights themselves. And I started looking across more and more types of animal species and at more and more types of weapon systems to see if I could find patterns. Now, clearly, some types of fights are won by traits other than big weapons. So swirling acrobatic midair battles of birds and butterflies and wasps, for example, where stamina and agility are likely to matter more, and where clunky, costly weapons would probably only slow you down. But it turned out that there was one key ingredient. There was something that I'd never thought of, something that, as far as I can tell, nobody in animal behavior had ever thought of, or even in biology. And that is this idea of duels. It turns out that the fights must play out as one-on-one duels rather than multiplayer scrambles. And the epiphany for me came from the military literature. And as I've already alluded, there's a rich and vast literature out there on technological innovations and on the evolution of manufactured weapons. Some incredibly smart historians have thought a great deal about when and why arms races occur. And they've done it without any biology at all. No evolution, no animal behavior, or otherwise. So they bring a fresh perspective to these topics. And in this case, the missing piece to the puzzle came from, sorry, did not anticipate that, sorry. So in this case, the missing piece to the puzzle came from the writings of a rather eclectic aeronautical and automotive engineer who, around the time of the First World War, set out to model battles of attrition. And I don't have time to go into the details of his models now, but the essence of his logic was this. If opponents can concentrate their fire, so if they can attack all at once, then given a choice between spending resources on bigger and better weapons or more training for your existing troops on the one hand, or spending those resources towards simply adding more troops on the other hand, it always pays to add more soldiers. Do not invest in expensive weapons and instead just get more soldiers. So Lanchester's laws, as these came to be called, are thought to have launched the soon thriving industry of operations research. And one of the lasting legacies of his work is this maxim of never divide your forces on the field of battle. Again, comes from the logic that more is better when all of your soldiers can attack at once. But it turned out it was the other half of Lanchester's logic that got me excited. Because if you turn his logic around, his models suggested that when soldiers do not concentrate their fire, so when instead they line up toe to toe and they confront each other one-on-one, then it often does pay to invest in bigger and bigger or better weapons. Because when the fights play out as duels, the better fighter wins. And it's no accident that for 5,000 years of recorded human history, in just about every culture, the only type of fight that has ever mattered for honor or status was a duel. Ritualized, repeatable, and fair. When rivals face each other in battle one-on-one, in contests of strength, the better fighter tends to win. And this often means the contestant with the biggest or the best or the most expensive weapons. So duels, military history suggested, could create situations where bigger weapons performed better than smaller ones. So duels could precipitate an arms race. Well, what about in animals? So this is the fun part, because I now think that the duels matter a ton in animal battles too. Fights that play out as duels tend to be predictable. They often escalate in a very protracted, even ritualized fashion, in these sort of ritualized contests of strength, where the bigger or the stronger male, so the male with the biggest weapons, is likely to win. If you contrast that with scrambles, on the other hand, where lots of rival males all tumble simultaneously into the fray, the outcomes of multi-attacker scrambles are often far less predictable. In fact, often they're wildly stochastic. In scrambles, the better fighter might not win, and costly big weapons are a lot less likely to be worth the price. So I now suspect that duels are the final piece to the puzzle, the third critical ingredient for precipitating animal arms races. And for the next few minutes, I want to just take this idea for a spin, because it turns out that there are some very predictable ecological situations, so backdrops for battles, if you will, that by their nature cause animal contests to necessarily play out as duels. And these situations, I now suspect, act like cauldrons, if you will, facilitating the rapid evolution of these extremely big weapons. And the first of these ecological situations is tunnels. I mean, sure, Tunnels restrict access to a resource. They do, they make it economically defensible, but they also align male contestants so that they necessarily confront each other face to face and one-on-one. 10 rivals can't attack all at once because only one of them can fit into the tunnel at a time. And I've already told you that for the dung beetles, the biggest difference between the species with and the species without horns was tunnels. Ball rolling species, which I'll note fight above ground in the open in mad scrambles that very often include multiple attackers in a big scrum or in a single fray. Ball rolling species never ever have these big horns. Tunnelers who fight face to face in these one-on-one duels very often do. In fact, lots of species with big weapons fight over tunnels once you start to look for it. So shrimp and crabs that fight over burrows often have huge claws, and fiddler crabs are great examples. Wasps with long tusks, big-headed, big-mandibled bees, tusked wettas, which are giant New Zealand cricket-like insects, even fanged frogs. All of these species fight inside burrows or tunnels. There was even a giant horned rodent, now extinct, that lived in the area near me in Montana that appears to have fought over burrows. So what I'm saying is that in species after species, the constrained space of a tunnel aligned male contests so that they necessarily occurred as duels. And that final ingredient appears to have triggered an arms race. Well, branches work the same way, incidentally. I mean, in a sense, a branch is just an inverse tunnel, since a branch, like a tunnel, is a linear substrate that can be blocked and along which rivals must pass. So I always like to picture Indiana Jones or a troll planting itself to guard a bridge. Branches also align fights so that rival males have to face each other one-on-one in a duel. So many species of rhinoceros beetles fight over branches, as do many of these leaf-footed bugs and stalk-eyed flies. Even horned chameleons fight over branches. And finally, there are lots of species that actually fight out in the open. So they're not in a tunnel or on a branch, they're out in the open, but they still tend to confront each other one-on-one in duels. Here, I think that it's actually the nature of the fight itself that results in the duel. Males in these species use their weapons as signals or as deterrents, sizing each other up and only escalating their contests in stages. So these fights ratchet up the danger in steps, and they only escalate all the way when the two rival males are very evenly matched. So fights like this don't happen by accident or by surprise. They escalate slowly and predictably, and by the time they get dangerous, they're always one-on-one. So even out in the open, their fights fulfill this last crucial prerequisite of unfolding in duels rather than scrambles. So what I'm proposing here is that we now have a generalizable explanation for when, where, and why particular species evolve these extreme weapons. When species meet these conditions, selection very often favors males with the biggest weapons, sort of pushing their weapons to the extreme. The missing ingredient for explaining the animal arms races then was this idea of duels. So changes in the location or the styles of battle caused males to begin to confront each other one-on-one in these contests of strength rather than in chaotic scrambles. And this simple change in behavior precipitated an arms race, triggering explosive evolution of bigger and bigger and bigger weapons. Well, I have to add that there's also very good evidence that duels matter for our own arms races too. I mean, after all, that's where the idea came from. In these cases, it's usually a technological innovation. So the addition of a battering ram to the front of a ship, for example, or mounting a machine gun on the nose of an airplane. New technologies like these can change the way that opponents or vehicles face each other in battle. And when they happen to cause opponents to face each other at close range and one-on-one, so when they cause what had been the military equivalent of a scramble to now unfold as a duel, they can precipitate an arms race. In fact, this simple logic appears to explain arms races in ancient oared galleys, in sailing galleons, in ironclad battleships. It explains the rapid evolution of armor in medieval knights and the explosive evolution of early fighter aircraft. All right, so the first big parallel then is duels. It's this idea that a certain type of fight, one-on-one encounters, helps precipitate arms races in both animal and military weapons. Well, it turns out that once started, both animal and military arms races, unfold in the same way. So these arms races proceed through the same sequence of stages, if you will. And one of those stages is deterrence. So as these weapons get big, they begin to function as signals, in addition to actual implements or tools of battle. So only the best conditioned males, so the absolute top of the lot with the largest body sizes and the best immune systems and the most stored nutrients and energy reserves, only the best of the best can produce the really, really big versions of these weapons. And this means that weapon size becomes a pretty good indicator, a billboard, if you will, of the fighting ability of each individual male. And rival males start using weapon size to decide whether or not to escalate a fight. They don't just lunge into battle, they assess each other beforehand. Whose weapon is bigger? Because weapons are honest signals of fighting ability, it often pays the smaller males to simply walk away. So what this means then is that weapons start to act as deterrents, settling contests without dangerous battle. And in fact, in the species with the biggest weapons of all, the overwhelming majority of contests get settled this way, without a fight. So in one study of caribou, for example, they watched more than 11,000 contests, and only 6 escalated all the way to full battle. 6 out of 11,000. Caribou have the largest weapons relative to their body size of any living vertebrate. And more than 99% of their battles or their contests get settled without a fight. So this leads to an odd paradox, that the species with the biggest weapons are often the most peaceful. I mean, make no mistake, they can and they definitely do fight. But full-on fights tend to be relatively rare in these species, and the net effect is peace. Well, we use our biggest weapons as deterrents too. During the heyday of the British Empire, for example, first-rate ships of the line were absolutely state-of-the-art weapons, and they made splendid deterrents. Simply sailing one of these ships into troubled waters could stop disputes on the spot. The wooden hull of one of these ships required more than 10,000 oak trees that are all over 100 years old each. And for European nations that were largely deforested already at that time, this cost was staggering. Most nations had none of these warships at all, and Britain kept dozens and dozens in her fleet. This period was called, incidentally, the Pax Britannica, or the British Peace. And we use our most expensive ships the same way today. An its class carrier and its associated strike group costs more than $20 billion. The United States has 11 of these carrier strike groups. No other nation has even one. China's the closest, but at the moment, no other nation has even one strike group. Massive, powerful, prohibitively expensive, our carriers function both as weapons and as deterrents, portable projections of military power that we shuttle like chess pieces to stabilize troubled regions and to implement our policy. And I'm telling you that these weapons at their core are no different than these. Extreme weapons are extreme weapons, and their biology really is the same. And I also have to point out that this same logic applies at the level of political landscapes and nation states too. So the Cold War, for example, the most terrifying arms race of all time, was at its core a duel, as the world stage coalesced around two opposing superpowers. And deterrence played a huge part in that arms race too. In fact, most of the scholars that I read on this time period would argue that deterrence is the only reason that we're still here today. All right, Now for the last, and arguably the best, certainly the most fun parallel. So you're stuck in an arms race, and weapon sizes are surging forward fast, evolving to bigger and bigger and bigger sizes, more elaborate, more extravagant, and much more expensive. Well, we've just seen that this makes these things awesome deterrents. They're billboards that honestly advertise the fighting ability of an opponent. They work as deterrents because only the best of the best, the richest nations and the biggest and healthiest bulls and bucks, only the wealthy can afford to pay these extraordinary costs. So what does everybody else do? Suppose you're not the biggest male on the block. You're smaller, you're weaker, life didn't smile on you the way that it did them. What do you do if you can't afford the biggest and the best weapons? The answer is you cheat. And it turns out that cheating is rampant. Once you start to look for it, you find it everywhere. So take dung beetles, for example. The biggest and the best males in these beetles, these are the guys with the huge horns. They win the fights. They guard the entrances to the tunnels containing the females and keep their rival males at bay. But not all males in these populations are big. And in fact, most of the males are pretty tiny. Well, tiny males don't play by the rules. So for one thing, they ditch the big weapons. Horns are expensive, and they're not going to help you anyway if you're tiny. So these little males are hornless, and they actually look and act a lot like females. And they sneak into tunnels on the sly. Instead of fighting a losing battle at the entrance, they dig their own tunnel, a side tunnel that intercepts the guarded tunnel beneath the guarding male. And in this way, they can sneak into a tunnel, go down and find the female, mate with the female, turn around and leave. They can be in and out of the tunnel in as little as 10 minutes flat. Well, sneakers like this lurk in all kinds of animal populations. Sneaky small cuttlefish cloak themselves in colors that look like females, and they sidle right up next to a courting male, actually slipping in between the male and the female. And sneaky male salmon zip into a territory, raining sperm down in a cloud over the eggs, in and out of a territory so fast that the territorial males can't stop them. And sneaky male bighorn sheep, called coursers, race into a bull's territory to mate with females while he's distracted in the middle of a fight. In species after species after species, males who cannot afford to play by the rules break the rules and cheat. Well, cheaters affect the whole dynamic of the arms race because they steal reproductive success from the big weaponed males. Those big males still pay the full price of building and using their weapons, so the cost that they pay stays the same. But now the payoffs or the benefits that they glean from having those weapons get smaller. Eggs that are fertilized by a sneaker male aren't fertilized by the guarding male. He produces the horns. He fights constantly to guard that tunnel and to protect access to the female, but the offspring of that tunnel still gets sired by another male. Well, as long as the sneaky males steal only a little bit, not much changes. The benefits of big weapons stay huge, and the arms race surges forward. But when cheaters start doing too well, they can collapse an arms race because suddenly it's not worth it anymore to produce the big weapons. Males without the big weapons start doing better than the males with the big weapons, and we expect these big weapons to quickly disappear. Well, cheaters erode the success of our biggest weapons too, and they've done it for thousands of years. Asymmetric warfare, guerrilla tactics are the classic cheat strategies. If you don't have the resources to face an invading force head on in conventional battle, don't. Guerrilla tactics are like sneaky male fish and beetles. They never wear military uniforms, for example. Instead, they hide, blending in with civilians in exactly the same way that sneaky dung beetles look and act like females. And they strike with quick, sneaky lunges, not open one-on-one battle. And they use makeshift, inexpensive weapons like Molotov cocktails, pipe bombs, and IEDs. So here too, as with animals, as long as these guerrilla tactics or these cheating tactics don't inflict that much damage, nothing changes. State-of-the-art weapons continue to be well worth their cost. But when a cheating tactic starts doing too well, then overnight, they can collapse an arms race. And it turns out that over and over throughout our history, technologies that cheated, that broke the rules of engagement, technologies that cheated have collapsed an arms race. Often, these involve a new type of weapon. Always they involve a tactic that's cheap. They win by not paying the price of the really big weapons and by rendering those expensive weapons obsolete. So English longbows and gunpowder, for example, spelled the end of medieval armor. I mean, once plate armor could be pierced, then suddenly it wasn't such a great idea to march into battle sitting astride a horse like a big, shiny, bulky target. And overnight, armor went from being a fantastic form of protection to an expensive, heavy, bulky liability. Well, so too, exploding shells shattered the arms race of sailing warships, and submarines caused ironclad battleships to be obsolete. And in every case, and there are dozens, new strategies that broke the rules of engagement caused our most expensive weapons to suddenly be obsolete, hugely expensive, and no longer worth the price. So as I close here, I have to flash forward to the present day, and I want to leave you with a sobering thought, because I'm starting to suspect that we may be dangerously close to a situation like this right now. As you all know, the United States today stands alone as the sole superpower. Our weapons are both exorbitantly expensive and truly magnificent. We have the most advanced weapons in the world, and we're almost certainly safer because of that. Our newest technologies have incredible potential both as weapons and as deterrence. So the Gerald Ford class aircraft carriers, for example, brand new at just $13 billion apiece, and the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter, an aircraft that costs $400 billion to design and build. These are great examples. But all of these weapons depend critically on software. Steering and navigation of our submarines and our aircraft carriers, guidance of our missile systems, the sensor nets that we deploy to detect incoming missiles, command and control, safeguards on our nuclear weapons. All of these things are controlled by computers and software. A pilot can't even fly a modern fighter without this software. These fly-by-wire systems, as they're called, are critical for handling these planes and for making sure that the pilots don't black out from the G-forces. And all of these systems are vulnerable to hackers. I mean, think about it, cyber hackers are the ultimate sneaks, surreptitiously worming into our control systems. I used to think that the danger of cyber hackers was a stolen credit card number or identity theft. And oh my gosh, did my worldview change when I started looking into all of this. So as you may or may not know, we've already been hacked several times. In 2004, the Chinese broke into a suite of our state-of-the-art weapons systems in an event called Titan Rain. And in 2013, we caught them at it again. This time, they'd compromised the Terminal High Altitude Missile Defense System, the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter, the F-22 Raptor, our MV-22 Osprey, as well as 37 other weapon systems, including our drones. And the scariest part about all of this, they weren't simply stealing secrets, they were inserting code. They were inserting code called zero-day attacks, code scripts that are designed to hide there, to lurk undetected. These scripts, had they not been detected, would have given the Chinese complete control over our weapon systems. So by activating these hidden programs, they could have turned our most expensive weapons against us, raising the alarming question of whether our weapons too might soon be obsolete, like medieval armor and battleships before them, simply no longer worth the price. The silver lining, if you want to call it that, is that the United States military is very well aware that this is a significant threat to our national security. And I had a chance to hear General Michael Hayden, former director of both the NSA and the CIA, talk at a conference on cybersecurity in Washington, DC in 2016. He considers cyber hacking to be threat number one. He considers cyberspace, incidentally, or the internet, to be the fourth theater of war. So land, sea, air, and now cyberspace. He says that the Chinese The Russians, the North Koreans, and probably also the Iranians have buildings full of hackers working 24/7 to break into our systems. This is the new arms race, since he also admits that we have just as many on our side working 24/7 to break into theirs. And at least according to him, our hackers are better than their hackers right now. I actually got to present at that conference too, right after General Hayden. If you can imagine me standing in front of that crowd talking about animal arms races and dung beetles to the chief technical officers of the FBI, the CIA, the DoD, the NSA, as well as Microsoft, Google, Northrop Grumman, and Lockheed Martin. Talk about a fish out of water. And to show you just how strange and exciting life can be and how far crazy ideas like this can take you, I recently got to witness these state-of-the-art technologies firsthand. The Navy was kind enough to fly me out to the USS Carl Vinson CVN-70, which is the head of our Carrier Strike Group 1, while it was at sea in the Pacific conducting operations. That meant we had to fly out to the carrier in these transport planes, catch the tripwire, slam to a stop from 150 miles an hour to 0 in 2 seconds, the arrested landing phenomenon. And we got to observe the inner workings of an aircraft carrier at sea as civilian guests, everything from the bridge down to the bowels of the ship. We got to stand on the flight deck as F-18 Super Hornets and F-35 strike fighters came screaming in for landing. This is my cell phone picture here, screaming in for landing, slamming onto the deck, yanking to a stop literally 20 feet in front of us. They're like, don't cross that line. And we didn't cross the line. It was incredible. I got to look at the new F-35 fighters up close. These are amazing instruments. The helmet alone for these fighters costs more than $500,000 a piece. And most importantly of all, I got to talk to the crew. Everything from talking to the captain and the first officers to the cooks and the mechanics and people working down in the bowels of the ship and controlling the nuclear reactors. They let us talk to anybody and everybody about anything we wanted. And I asked them all about the threat of cyber hacking. And guess what? It's threat number one. They worry about this one all the time. This is the threat that keeps them awake at night. So as I end, I have to confess that all of this has been a rather wild journey for me, way more wild than anything I could have imagined. I am, after all, a biologist. I study beetles, not battleships. And I used to be nervous about writing and talking about the parallels with these military technologies. I titled my book on all of this Animal Weapons, honestly, because I was scared to go all in with the military implications. I'm not scared now. I've talked to admirals and generals, foot soldiers, sailors, historians, and chief technical officers of the Department of Defense, the FBI, the CIA, and the NSA. These parallels are real. And I love the idea that basic research can go so far. I mean, who'd have thought that poking around in the dirt and the mud watching dung beetles in a rainforest could ever tell us anything interesting or exciting or relevant about our own weapons technologies or about national security. But I have to say that the more I dug, the more convinced and astonished I became that there really are parallels between animals and ourselves. And I know already that these parallels are transforming how we in my lab, in my group, think about biology. They're guiding new research in directions that we never could have anticipated. And my gut tells me that it's going to be just as exciting the other way around. So for example, if you follow United States national defense strategy, it's all coalescing around something called great power competition, which sure looks to me like we're setting ourselves up for yet another duel, this time with China. And I think biology has a lot to tell us about how that situation might turn out. But for now, at least, I hope I've convinced you that there are some exciting and surprising insights to be gleaned from the extraordinary weapons of beetles and crabs and caribou and elk. Thank you.
Let's give a big round of applause for Dr. Doug Emlen.
Visual applause. And I apologize for the telephone going off. I thought I had taken care of. Rookie mistake.
You know, it's we did one of these shows a couple of weeks ago, and the guest speaker's pet jumped up onto the place where they were sitting and wouldn't stop mewing. So I figured there's just all kinds of things. You just helped me check off my live stream bingo card for my quarantine program bingo card for that one.
There you
So
go. Phone goes off. Honestly, it's a satellite phone, and actually took the handset upstairs and put it in a different part of the house. I didn't realize that the base station also rings. So
oh wow.
we thought of it, but whatever. Anyway,
Well, thank you very much. Gosh, there's so much to think about with
I told you I talk fast. Yeah, no,
yeah,
no, this is wild. It's crazy.
but yeah, I mean the parallels that you draw are uncanny. But then at the same time, it makes a lot of sense because we're animals too, right? We just have access to these extremely sophisticated tools that other animals haven't decided they need to make use of.
Yeah, I think for a long time, even in biology, we were all sort of trained to think about biological evolution as something that was fundamentally different from things like cultural evolution, because biology is all about DNA and parents and offspring and change that happens across generations. And so when you talk about something like an elk, you know, elk antlers get built or transmitted or copied when the elk reproduce, because it's the offspring that produce the next round of elk. So you're necessarily talking about an information flow of DNA carrying the message from generation to generation to generation. And you're talking about turnover among individuals. In the elk, if some antlers do better, the way that antler spreads is those individuals have more offspring and the other individuals don't. So you get sort of traditional biological evolution. And for years, we were cautioned to draw this clean line in the sand. You know, you could talk about superficial similarities, but if you're going to step over that line, it's different. When you talk about cultural evolution, it's not the same. I don't believe that anymore. It is the same. I mean, the currency is different. So when we're talking about military technologies, it's not about who has the most kids. The currency of success or failure isn't numbers of offspring. But the phenomenon, the processes like selection still work the same way. Successful models get copied and copied and copied, and everybody wants them. More armies are trying to buy them, and everybody's racing to develop them, and they become much, much more prevalent and abundant in the market, and the less successful ones disappear. So turnover works the same way. It's just the currencies are different. So no, I think the parallels, I think the logic works in exactly the same way. Once you're willing to accept that a technology, something we build that's not based in DNA, can actually change over time and evolve. Sorry, I went off on that one. So it's a hot button issue for me because I've had people push back saying you can't make those, make the comparisons. I think you really can.
Very, very interesting stuff. Well, I want to remind everybody watching, you can post questions in the comments and in the chat box, and we'll grab those and pose them to Doug as we go through the program here. So type up what you're thinking there, let us know, and we'll keep the conversation rolling. And a few questions have already come in, and I'll take them from the top. Trace Harden was asking, what is on your hat?
Oh, I'm at the University of Montana. So it is the Grizz logo for the University of Montana, showing my school spirit.
Now, let's see. Now back to your presentation. My museum YouTube moderator actually posed a pretty good question. It sounds like the duel is a mechanism to establish who is the top dog without actually killing off useful members of the population. Is that more or less correct?
More or less. Some more, some less. So let's deconstruct that statement little by little. The idea, the duel, so say it again. Read it again.
Okay. Sorry. The duel is a mechanism to establish who is the top dog without actually killing off useful members of the population.
Okay. So the actually killing off useful members of the population part, I'm going to cut loose from that statement because selection doesn't work that way. It doesn't. Things that are good for the population usually aren't the things that spread. It's all based on individual success. So who are the individual males that are winning, that get access to females that reproduce, that have more kids, that spread the characteristics within the population. But what you find is if I'm a male and I'm fighting for me and I'm fighting another rival male, what you find is one option is you go all in and you fight to the death, and there are animals that do that. But that's a very dangerous way to play the game. If I have an option of sizing up my opponent and figuring out ahead of time, wow, he's 3 times as big as I am, I'm probably going to lose, then as an individual, it's not because it doesn't kill animals unnecessarily. It's a selfish decision that I make as a male, sizing up a situation, saying, you know what? I think I'm going to get clobbered and maybe killed if I go into that fight. I'll back down. Animals evolved to be very good at making calculated decisions and estimating risk. They're not necessarily doing it consciously, but in principle, they're making decisions based on how big their weapon is to an opponent's weapon. And what that means is not all fights result in carnage and killing. Lots and lots of fights sort themselves out with these early initial stages. So very often animals start to size each other up gently. If you've ever seen elk or deer, they spar. They don't go in for the kill. They spar, they push a little bit. Oh, he's stronger. It gives the males information that they can use as individuals, but it's still a selfish decision. I'm a male, I'm sparring against an opponent. Am I likely to win? Am I not likely to win? If I'm likely to get clobbered, the best thing I can do is back away and not get brutally maimed in the process. And so, again, I'm saying, yes, that's what's going on. The duels result in contests that result in the top dog winning. But the reason they do that is because of the decision-making of individuals, not because the collective benefit is for the good of the species. Does that make sense? Kind of? Did I get into the weeds and make it more complicated than it needed to be? You're muted.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
Okay, cool.
So thank you.
I jumped on it because I teach animal behavior.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the issues that we spend a lot of time talking about is whether this process of selection in natural populations tends to work at the level of individuals. So characteristics get favored because the individuals that perform those behaviors or have those traits do better. Or does it tend to work for the good of the species? And what you find over and over again is even though thinking of things as benefiting the species is intuitive and it feels good, it's not the way biology works. So because that question was phrased in a way that sort of landed right in the middle of one of the misconceptions we tackle in my class, I jumped on it. But I apologize if I made it harder than it needed to be.
No, that was a great explanation.
Okay.
Thank you. But we got more cool questions coming in, so I'm going to keep rolling with them. Dina on Facebook is asking, what animal has the deadliest weapon?
Okay. So one thing I'll add, first of all, is that as you pointed out at the beginning, my obsession is with the big stuff. The big stuff usually isn't the deadliest stuff. It's one of the interesting caveats. Big weapons can be very dangerous, but if you want to go really deadly, you're probably going to go with chemical weapons, which is a whole nother arena that I haven't messed with. And there are some animals with toxins that are really, really lethal. And I could pull a bunch of examples out of a hat, but there's some beautiful studies that have been done, some of them around near you in the eastern United States, having to do with interactions between garter snakes and the salamanders that they eat. And there's a West Coast population that feeds on a salamander that is really, really, really toxic. And so the skins of some of those things can be among the deadliest. The tetrodotoxin in pufferfish is considered one of the deadliest. There's some really nasty toxins out there. But it's interesting, I don't think it's an accident that the deadly weapons tend to be chemical weapons, which work in a different kind of a context and are often used between predators and prey, killing prey. Whereas the kinds of weapons that I'm talking about get really extravagant and they get big and they get expensive, but they're not necessarily deadly. They can be deadly, but that's not their primary function. And most of the time they're not. They're used to settle contests, but they settle contests in ways that involve a lot of mutual assessment, and they ratchet up little by little, and then they can ratchet up and ratchet down again. They get used in ways that means that they're only very rarely actually deadly. So that's
next question. Thank you. All right, we got another good one. Humans, and this is a good parallel between what's going on with the US military right now. Humans use drones as weapons. Are there any animals that do the same? That's a huge leap there.
Now, there is a whole issue that we could get into that's a big one in the military about should the future of aerial weapons go in the direction of drones, or should they continue to involve human-powered craft? That's a big hot button issue that a lot of people are debating. But animal examples of drones. I mean, in a sense, social insect colony, I'm thinking on the fly here. Social insect colonies often have soldier individuals that are non-reproductives within the colony that are specialized as, as disposable units that you can throw into a conflict that will essentially sacrifice themselves to protect the group. They're like they're alive, so they're not totally like drones, but they're kind of like drones in the sense that they're a force of soldiers that are specialized for that function. Termites do this, a number of ants do this, big heads, big weapons, little squirt guns that squirt sticky stuff at opponents, but and there's even some that explode. They are essentially in a position to self-destruct to protect the colony. I guess that's sort of like drones. I don't know, hadn't thought of that. They're definitely, drones are the smallest micro drones are all modeled on animals. So there certainly are animals that fly that maneuver like drones. So if you're not thinking of it as a weapon equivalent, but you're thinking of what drones are doing, I think there's a huge area that's at the interface of physics and biology that's modeling micro drones off of insects, learning how does a rhinoceros beetle fly, and what does it take to produce stable flight that you could control and that you could manipulate over a good distance in something the size of a beetle, because we are making technologies like that are self-contained. So there's a ton of parallels between drones and animals, but as a military equivalent, I think I'm having trouble finding one. I'm giving you like 10-minute answers. I should try to keep it quick. Sorry.
I like your comparison there, though. The expendable members of an ant colony, for example, because ant colonies are huge, and it's more like the colony operates as a single organism rather than the individuals. Yeah,
it does. That's exactly right.
Okay, let me get to another one here. Let's see. We've got a Professor Ben from genetics.
Uh-oh.
So get ready. Wondering if arms races between species parallel modern cybersecurity races, such as how parasites or viruses infect their hosts to increase their success.
All right, read that one. That's not a genetics question at all. So read it to me. So yes, I think there's parallels with cybersecurity warfare. I mean, in the sense that
definitely,
much as you would have, one of the things I didn't talk about here, but was really fun reading about, and I went into in my book, was the idea that you do have arms races between sort of defenders and attackers that you see with the evolution of fortifications and siege warfare technologies. And so there's an escalation of bigger and bigger catapults and thicker and taller walls, and corners give way to round things. And you get arms races with something trying to break in to a fortress and the fortress trying to defend itself. That happens over and over again. And I do think there's animal parallels there too, with termite mounds that really are fortresses. They have tons of parallels to our own fortresses, and they're protecting the termite colonies from army ants that are coming on the outside. So in a sense, the cyber world is like that. We've got to build our firewalls within firewalls within firewalls, and we're trying to protect our core systems from attacks that are coming from the outside. So tons of parallels there. The virus bit is a twist. And I mean, it's a twist in another reason, because there are computer viruses, obviously, which in many ways are reminiscent of the way an virus, that's where the name came from, a virus would infect a healthy multicellular animal, like the coronavirus, for example. But viruses also infect systems and can corrupt or destroy software. So there's an arms race there too, right? We're constantly trying to recognize and build in fixes to block, like an immune system adapting to exposure to new threats. We're constantly, the cyber companies that protect and encrypt our stuff are constantly updating their systems to be able to detect and block whatever the latest viruses are. So yeah, in those, the more I'm thinking out loud, it's absolutely parallel in lots and lots of ways.
So it's sort of like there are weapons that we develop, or we develop strategies to cheat against one another, but then we either co-opt those same weapons or develop different ones for competition against other species.
Yes. And there's two ways to run with that. One of them is, yes. So you have this weird paradox that even species like rattlesnakes that would have a really deadly venom that they can use to kill another species, like their prey, they rarely would ever use that venom when they're fighting each other. So when males are fighting males, they don't go nuclear, so to speak. They fight with conventional weapons. They use the deadly weapon to kill their prey. And so there's this, it's an interesting, fun twist in these behaviors. But I want to make it even more complicated, because if you think about it in terms of military technologies, you can think of it at the level of each weapon system, like aircraft versus aircraft, or vehicle versus vehicle. But at the end of the day, most governments do it all, right? We have our offensive conventional weapons, and we also have people cyber hacking into our opponents. And when navies became crippled by submarines, everybody added submarines to their fleets too. So now we have submarines as part of our arsenal. So we do the dominant tactic and we do the sneak tactic. We do it all. So when you think of it at that level, we all fold all of those types of things into our systems and into our strategies. But when you really want to think about the weapons themselves, you got to look at it from the perspective of the costs and benefits of that weapon and what it does and what its equivalent or its opponent or its rival would be in another country or on the other side of the battlefield.
So I'm curious, in almost all of these examples, we're talking about weapons in males. Why don't very many female species, at least none that I can really think of right now, have mega weapons?
So I have an answer ready for that one, because I prompted the question at the beginning of the talk. So can I flip back the slides? Can you still see my slides?
Yeah, go ahead.
Can you see that? Yes?
Oh, I don't. Nope.
So what do I have to do? Share my screen?
Yes.
I
Just
warned
as before.
I did warn you this would take 2 seconds. There we go. Share.
Our viewers haven't left us yet. They're hanging in.
All right, there. Can you see me now? Can
Yes.
you see it? All right. So the idea then is, why is it usually males and not females? It comes down to this idea that this process of sexual selection is ultimately about competition over access to reproduction. So either males fighting with males over access to females, or females fighting females over access to males. And the question then is, why would it be one-sided? So you have to step back a second and say, why would there be any competition at all? I mean, if you go out into the wild, and that's what my diagram here shows, if you go out into the wild and you do a head count of animals in pick beetles, pick, I don't know, rhinoceroses, pick elk, any animal you want. If you walk into a population and you do a head count, you're going to find pretty close to a 50-50 ratio of males and females. So in a sense, mathematically, at least there's one male for every female done. Why is there any competition for access to mates at all if there's pretty much one male out there for every female out there in the population? In fact, we all know that it doesn't work that way. It's just that most of us never stop to think about why it doesn't work that way. Well, in order to reproduce, an animal has to be physiologically ready to breed. So they have to be old enough, they have to be sufficiently well fed, and they have to have gametes, so eggs or sperm, that are sort of ready to go. But it turns out not all individuals in a population are ready to breed at any point in time. And that's where the crux of this issue comes from. It takes animals a little while to recycle from one breeding event to the next. And in many species, it takes females a lot longer to recycle than it does males. So I started here. If you look at males in most animals, a male mates, and it literally a few hours, sometimes even a few minutes later, that male is physiologically capable of turning around and mating again. He's got to replenish his sperm. But as soon as that's done, that male could, in principle at least, turn right around and reproduce a second time. So the turnaround time between successive potential reproductive events in males is usually really short. Now consider females, though. In many, many animals, females invest an awful lot more into offspring than the males do. So the eggs are much larger than sperm, for example, and they're packed with nutrients that are going to sustain and nourish the embryo, like lipids, proteins, sugars. Simply preparing the next batch of eggs or yolking up a clutch can take days or weeks for females, depending on the species. If you add to that pregnancy, so holding the young inside your body where they can be nourished and protected and fed, and by the way, flies and cockroaches do this too. It's not just mammals that do this. Pregnancy takes even more time. And all that time, and then there's also protecting your young and taking care of them after they hatch. So all this time, females are engaged in these types of tasks. They're not available for reproducing. They're physiologically incapable of breeding again. So when you step back and think about it, both males and females have to allow a little bit of time to recharge or recycle between successive bouts of reproduction. But these turnaround times can be really, really different. They can be minutes to hours in the cases of males, and sometimes weeks or months or even years in the case of the females. So now when you come back to this schematic and you come back to your hypothetical animal population, sure, there might be equal numbers of males and females if all we did is go count male, male, female, female, do a head count on the landscape. But how many of these individuals are actually ready to breed right now? At any point in time, if we went out there and we surveyed a natural population and we asked how many males and how many females are capable of reproducing right now, that's where we'd start to find a difference. We'd find that most, if not all, of the males are ready to go. There's not really a surprise there, but lots of the females are not. Many of the females may be pregnant, or they may be nursing, or they're committed to existing young, and therefore they're not ready to turn around and breed again. Now, sometimes this discrepancy is pretty trivial. In species where both the males and the females invest a lot in offspring, they're sort of both tied down for comparable periods. But in many, many, many animals, these differences can be profound. And in some cases, they can be really stunning. And we find many, many more males out there on the landscape, sort of ready to go, ready to breed, than there are females. So this is the sort of essence of this idea of sexual selection. And the result of this kind of a situation is competition. And sometimes it is intense competition with lots of males out there scrambling and fighting and competing for access to a very small number of females who are physiologically ready to breed at that point in time. So that's my answer. Sorry, it took 2 minutes, I warned you, but it takes a few diagrams to really do that one justice.
No, that explains it all very simply. Thank you.
Cool. All right.
So, okay, two more, and then I'll let everybody go. You can get back to your evenings. But I'm so glad that you're still here with us. Okay, we had one from my YouTube moderator. Is there something similar in the natural world to weapons that just can't get bigger? Is there an upper limit to the size of a weapon?
There is. They come in lots of forms. And especially when you deal with the really crazy stuff like I love to think about, you really do sort of push up against those upper bounds. They come in different ways. Sometimes it's a physical limitation. I mean, there's an interesting phenomenon, for example, if you think of lever mechanics, that if you imagine something bending along a fulcrum, the longer something gets, the weaker it necessarily gets. It's physics. That's why you squeeze with a nutcracker, you squeeze against the hinge because you're so much stronger there than you are if you squeeze with the tips of your nutcracker. And so as weapons get longer, depending on how they're used, they sometimes get weaker. And that puts the sort of upper bound. It can look really big, but it also might be weak. There's some fun ways animals have got around that. So some of the crab claws, they'll have a really huge claw that looks like a signal that they wave, but there's a tooth that sticks out near the base that they use when they squeeze that works just like nutcrackers. So they can concentrate the force near the hinge, even though the whole thing is big. But in general, there's a physical upper bound because as some of these things get longer, they also get weaker, which makes them less useful. Sometimes you reach an upper bound where they can start to break or structurally they'll fail. So you can overcome all these things, but it costs a lot. It takes a lot of resources to structurally reinforce these things so that they maintain their function when they get big. So very often the cost is what pushes back. They get more and more expensive and you reach a point where it's not that they couldn't get bigger, it's that if they do get bigger, it's not worth it. You're spending more on that structure than you get in return. And that benefit cost balance sort of says once you go past this point, it's not worth it anymore and the population adjusts and settles. So we do find limits, but not as often as you might think. I mean, I really think what happens is you reach a balance where the reason there's a limit is just that these things are pricey and it's just not worth the cost.
Makes a lot of sense. And last question is mine, because I know that you just had a new book come out, Beetle Battles, for middle schoolers. Yeah, there's a copy of it. Perfect.
Into that, yeah.
And in
I
your
did.
presentation, oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead. I was just going to say I did. It was a chance to take some of the ideas that I just talked about in this talk, but unpack them as narrative nonfiction, sort of using all the crazy, stupid things I've done in my life and all the misadventures and the experiments that didn't work, and tell that story. How does a muddy boots biologist poking around in a rainforest end up giving a talk to the former head of the NSA and the CIA, or flying out to an aircraft carrier? I mean, that's a really bizarre jump. But I think there's a couple fun lessons there, because none of that was expected, and I certainly didn't see it coming. So there's a journey there, and it shows the process of science and the unexpected directions that science can take you. And there's a lot of adventure there. So I had a chance to try to tell that story so that it hopefully would be engaging and relevant to middle school age kids, and sort of immerse them in an adventure that is authentic because it's real, and that feels relevant, and that sort of, it doesn't just say here's how science works, it shows them. You sort of live it and feel it through all the mistakes and the ups and downs. You learn about the process of science by being immersed in the process of science. So I don't know, we'll see if it works. It's my first attempt. I had an amazing editor who made me rewrite it like 4 times until I got it where she wanted it. So we will see. But thanks for letting me give a shout out. It just came out this spring. So
That's awesome.
thanks.
So that's, I think that's our show.
Well, thank you very much. It's nice to do something different, even if I didn't get to come out and visit and have some barbecue in real life. But
next time, soon, we hope,
yeah,
as appropriate.
sounds good. Stay safe, everybody.
Thank you so very much for doing this. I really appreciate it. I also want to say thanks to the digital media group at the Museum of Natural Sciences, who are making all of this stuff possible for us to bring these shows to you, and hopefully give you a great experience. For my moderators online who are watching social media platforms, many, many thanks to all of you. Thanks to all of you who stuck with us and who watched the show. I hope that you enjoyed the program. We will be back here next Thursday night, 7 o'clock, at the museum's YouTube and Facebook pages. We'll have the Virtual Science Cafe with us again. Next week, May 14th, we will have the museum's head of paleontology, Dr. Lindsay Zano. Lindsay is an expert on big carnivores. So if you're curious about the big meat-eating dinosaurs, think T-Rex and relatives, you'll probably want to be here for the Virtual Science Cafe next Thursday at 7. As always, like and subscribe to the museum's YouTube channel. That way you know when cool new sciencey things are happening. You can click the bell to get notified. Follow us on social media, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. You can find us at Natural Sciences. And I want everybody to know, too, about a very special page on our website, naturalsciences.org. There you'll see our Science at Home page, which we update daily with new do-it-yourself at-home science activities, lessons, new videos to watch. You can find our archive of other presentations. Hundreds of videos are there and available to you on just about any topic you could imagine. So take a scroll through naturalsciences.org to learn more. And I hope we'll see you next time. Doug, once again, thanks for being here. Thanks for doing this.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Take care.
And take care. Bye, everyone. Stay safe.